Now this is almost too in your face to be a real Easter egg, but I have this nagging suspicion that if I don't bring it up, the comments will never let me hear the end of it, so here we go. As the episode begins, before we even get to see what lies beyond the void, we are given a little taste of the vastness of time, as several sound bites from characters all over the MCU are played over the usual Marvel Studios logo. But there are others in there too, from various corners of real-world history. Among these voices, you hear Maya Angelou, Greta Thunberg, Nelson Mandela, Malala Yousafzai, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Neil Armstrong, and Alan Watts. It's almost like the Wall of Mentors from Seoul. If there were fewer of them, and some of them were alive. So, not like that at all, actually. Moving on. Ever since Episode 1 aired and audiences were introduced to the TVA and the Timekeepers, comic book fans have been bringing up the being known as He Who Remains. A man who, as the last survivor of the multiverse that came before the one we all currently know, created the Timekeepers to keep the timeline regulated as a sort of take-two after his former creations, the Time Twisters, turned more aggressive than anticipated. And sure enough, that is indeed who is waiting for Loki and Sylvie beyond the void. However, this seemingly jovial, omniscient fellow is a far cry from the withered, ancient being in the comics and seems to share more characteristics with, and hold on to your hats now, Kang the Conqueror. Now, we know that the time-dominating supervillain has been referenced multiple times throughout the show so far, and that it doesn't seem like he turned out to be the final villain like some folks predicted, but I swear we're not trying to pull a Mephisto here. There are details that line up pretty well, such as claiming to be born in the 31st century, whereas Kang was born in the 30th in the comics, a change that was probably made to line up with the comics being released in the 20th century, while this show was released in the 21st. But, most tellingly, he refers to himself as a conqueror when he brings up the many things people have called him over time. And really, he did sort of conquer time. Though he ended up strictly regulating it rather than ruling individual eras with an iron fist like Kang. And this diversion from the main Kang does bring another character to mind. The Marvel Comics have no shortage of characters that, in one way or another, regulate, attempt to conquer, or generally work with the very fabric of time and reality itself. And one of those beings would be Immortus. Now, why am I bringing up this guy and his doofy-looking helmet? Well, let's take a second to look at what He Who Remains tells us about his origin story. That he was a scientist who discovered alternate timelines, only for all of his variants to end up waging war, making him decide to regulate time to prevent a more evil version of himself from doing far worse. Now, to skip like a lot of convoluted details from the comics, one version of Kang eventually grew tired of being a time conqueror and constantly getting his butt kicked by various superheroes and retreated to a realm beyond time called Limbo. This is where the Timekeepers later found him and offered him immortality in exchange for making him the guardian and administrator of time for an 80 millennia time span. Thus, Immortus works to keep the timeline stable and regulated, pruning away the chronal branches as a gardener of time, to use the younger Kang's own words. Now that does sound a lot like what the MCU version of He Who Remains is doing, even though the pecking order between him and the Timekeepers has been reversed. Oh, and the fact that he's wearing a purple cape, a primarily green outfit, and a golden crest on his chest sure don't hurt the comparison either. Probably should have led with that. Oh no, we're not done with Kang just yet. Now, going back to He Who Remains' story of meeting several versions of himself, it brings to mind how there have been a few groups of Kang variants in the comics. One of these consisted of 3 different Kangs, led by the Prime Kang, and simply called themselves the Council of Kangs. And no, Rick and Morty fans, the Council of Ricks didn't come up with the multiversal councils first. Anyway, turns out the creation of this council was a ruse by Immortus, who attempted to trick Prime Kang into destroying all his other variants so that he could ensure that his existence as Immortus remained unthreatened. And then there's a second Council of Kangs, this time giving themselves the even longer title of the Council of Cross-Time Kangs. But these guys weren't actually imposters. A group of various beings who had defeated the robot doubles Kang used to govern over their individual realities, only to then take their equipment and disguise themselves as him in an attempt to acquire a powerful weapon and take out the Prime Kang. Not that it went too well for them, since Prime Kang eventually, more or less, fed them to Alioth. Whoops. Oh, and I would be remiss not to mention the Kang Collective, consisting of Kangs from various realities rather than timelines, one of whom was a kangaroo, named Kangaroo the Conqueror. And you know, my only question regarding that is, when are Kangaroo the Conqueror and Alligator Loki getting their own movie? Huh. Yeah, get on that, Marvel. The public demands it. And of course, we can't talk about Kang without also talking about Ravonna Renslayer, depicted here as the dutiful leader of the TVA, clinging to the idea that there must be a good reason behind all the lies. Ravonna's story in the comics as the subject of Kang's affections has led to her having almost as convoluted a career as Kang himself. Many different time-divergent versions of her have gone by many, many names. These include Terminatrix, Temptress, and Revelation. And heck, she's even taken the name Kang for herself here and there. But one of these many names show up in the episode, ready to be spotted by keen-eyed viewers. Knowing that all TVA employees in this show were originally variants, we do get to see a glimpse of Ravonna's former life as a schoolteacher in Ohio in 2018, and a look at her diploma reveals her name to be Rebecca Tourmanet. Now this is the same name used by one version of Ravonna who managed to drag herself and Kang to the early 1900s to live out relatively normal, equal lives as the married couple Rebecca Tourmanet and Victor Timely, as opposed to their usual temporal power struggles. Terminatrix, Tourmanet, I bet that name took her like a whole 5 minutes to come up with. Okay, I've said Kang so many times now that it's starting to lose all meaning. So let's wrap this video up with a smaller but still interesting detail. As Loki and Sylvie enter He Who Remains' citadel, we see statues of the Timekeepers. But you may notice that there's a fourth pedestal and a broken statue on the floor. This is because while the Timekeepers are known as a trio, He Who Remains actually did originally create 4 Timekeepers in the comics. However, one was banished to ancient Egypt, took up the identity of the Oracle of Siwa, and had a brief encounter with the Fantastic Four. Since He Who Remains created them as a ruse in the MCU continuity, it seems unlikely that there's a 4th Timekeeper running around anywhere, or anyone I guess. But it's still a nice nod to the comic books.